Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a good week and your interviews went well. I'm going to finish up some of the content we didn't get to in our class period last Sunday. So all you have to do for this week is finish Chapter 4 or read it if you didn't have a chance to yet. The objectives for really the whole chapter and this session are understanding the core social work values and how they play out in the real world, what it really looks like when the rubber meets the road. The second thing is to develop self-awareness and professional competence by examining some of the tensions that can occur when our personal values intersect or conflict with professional values. And third, to learn the role that NASW, which stands for National Association of Social Workers, Code of Ethics plays in guiding professional practice. Values, by the way, are really just preferred conceptions or beliefs about how things ought to be. Social workers must recognize that clients have personal values that shape their beliefs and behaviors, and that those values may be in conflict with the social worker's own values or with those of the profession. Occasionally, we as social workers encounter situations in which we cannot conform to our profession's values, or in which a client's behavior or goals create such powerful reactions in us that a constructive relationship can't be established. So I can't remember if I told you in class about a client I had once when I was working with gay youth who at our first intake revealed to me he was from South Boston, that he was a neo-Nazi and was a little bit obsessed with Hitler and Hitler's birthday, and then started talking about women in a way that was incredibly uncomfortable to me. And I had to get a lot of help from coworkers and my supervisor about how to work with him, and ultimately I just couldn't do it. He had to work with a male social worker in our organization who felt safer. So in those instances, it's really important to acknowledge, you are human. It's a normal reaction, and explore them in supervision or your own therapy. One thing I wanted to point out is that there are laws and regulations. So being a mandated reporter, as we are required to, by law, to report child abuse, and we can be held legally accountable to that. But over on the right-hand side here, I wonder if the pointer works when I do this. I'm going to try. So this is the Code of Ethics that is developed by the National Association of Social Workers, NASW. NASW is the licensing body for social workers. They're the ones that create the tests that you'll be tested on if you go for licensure. They are our regulatory board. And so their job is to really identify the core values on which our social work mission is based, to hold us as social work professionals accountable, to really socialize new social workers to social work's mission, values, ethical principles, and ethical standards, and establish a method to establish a method to decide how to punish people if there are breaches of unethical conduct. So if something is not against the law, but it is unethical, it can be reported to the National Association of Social Workers, and they can hold the social worker accountable and maybe lose their license if they have done a severe ethical violation, such as sexual conduct with a client. So the NASW Code of Ethics contains 155 standards addressing a variety of ethical issues. It's a good thing to have on your desk and to consult when questions come up, but it helps you also think about a range of roles, such as being a social worker, being a teacher, being a supervisor, etc. Okay, so the social work core values are service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relationships, integrity, competence, And I would say there's another one called service, being of service. Those are the core values, but they're pretty abstract. You can read about them. They make a lot of sense, but they don't give you a ton of guidance for what, like, when real life happens on the road. And so that's where I think these 4 principles come in. The 4 key areas of immediate relevance to direct practitioners are self-determination, providing informed consent, preserving professional boundaries, and safeguarding confidentiality. We talked already in class a little bit about this informed consent. Oh, I spelled that wrong. My bad. Informed consent procedure that I learned called BRAIDED. I like it because it's at least an acronym that can help you remember the steps of informed consent. I'm not going to go over them again because we have already done so in class, but please do email me if you have questions or write your question down and we'll discuss it in class next. So boundaries. We didn't get to talk about this too much. The Code of Ethics covers boundaries in many scenarios. So that's boundaries in your relationship with clients, in your relationships with colleagues, your relationships with supervisors and administrators, how much time you devote to your work, and also the amount of time and quality of energy spent on your off-the-job activities and relationships. So you want to keep an eye on your boundaries in all of those areas. So if you find yourself devoting extra time and attention to particular clients, and it happens, we all have our favorite clients. Some clients require more energy than others, but treating one client differently than you do others may be a cue that your boundaries are overextended. So talk about it in supervision. If you have a favorite client, talk about it in supervision. If you're tempted to break the rule for a client, talk about it in supervision. You might be right to do so, but you need to talk it through with somebody else. The second that you're starting to keep secrets is the second that you know you may be on the edge of a boundary violation. In your relationship with colleagues, make sure, or actually on a consistent basis, make sure you're using whatever your organization's process is for communicating with clients. So those forms of communication systems can include office, email, or voicemail, dedicated cell phones, receptionists or call centers. Your organization might have on-call staff or off-hour referrals to emergency rooms, 911, etc. You might think you're helping clients by deviating from those procedures. So, for example, by encouraging them to contact you directly in a crisis rather than going through the appropriate channels. At some point, however, I guarantee you, from personal experience, you will be unable to respond to a client in need during off hours. And that happens. They may lose trust in you or be reluctant to seek help in other ways, or, God forbid, they do something to harm themselves and you didn't respond in time. Recognize that exceeding your professional boundaries with clients sets up your colleagues also and your organization for failure. So going beyond your normal role creates an unfair expectation that your coworkers will do the same. Inconsistent boundaries within teams and organizations can confuse the clients and also cause a lot of conflict between you and coworkers if you're setting different standards for different clients. Be careful in your use of social media. I mean, this is the #1 thing that people talk about these days. I'm going to come back to this one, actually. But in terms of media, do also remember not to access, without informed consent, any online information about your clients. And remember that posting negative information about your workplace or any of your coworkers may demonstrate lack of respect and may violate the Code of Ethics set forth by NASW, and also it could get you fired. And I've heard of those kind of situations. Finally, be really aware of the ways in which you're absorbing work stress and take steps to manage that stress. So even social workers with excellent external boundaries, such as keeping their regular work schedule, find themselves taking work home on an emotional level. And that can really result in persistent worry and thinking about client situations while you're away from the job. or start to create in you fears of being inadequate, being a poser, being a fake, not really having the skill to do the work right. That's just work-related stress, and it can result in kind of hypervigilance within your personal life. So, for example, you might fear the onset of an illness despite having no symptoms because of constant exposure to client illnesses. Writing about feelings, talking with someone you trust can really help process the impact of your work on your life and really help you keep a boundary between your personal and professional life. This gets easier as you go along in the profession, but in the first couple of years, it can be really challenging. I know I personally spent many long nights thinking about and worrying about clients that I was working with. I'm not saying to do that is wrong. I'm just saying make sure you don't do it alone. Look to some issues of boundaries later. But to help you think through some decision-making guidelines when it comes to difficult choices around these ethical principles. This guy, Raymer, did something in 1989, I think it was, that helped to kind of guide you in some decision-making. He said the right to life, health, well-being, and the necessities of life take precedence over rights to confidentiality. That's a lot of words, but basically what that means is if someone's life is in danger, then that takes precedence over the right to confidentiality. So that's like a mandated reporting situation as an example. So if a child's life is in danger or their well-being is in danger because they're being abused at home, you're going to break confidentiality and report that. The second guideline he gives is that an individual's basic right to well-being takes precedence over another person's right to privacy, freedom, or self-determination. Again, a lot of words, but it's basically saying that a person's right to life takes precedence over someone else's privacy, right? So an example for that may be encouraging a client to report a rape or domestic abuse. Third, a person's right to self-determination takes precedence over his or her right to basic well-being. Here's an interesting one. So their right to self-determination takes precedence over the right to their own well-being. So, great example, happens all the time. An elderly person you're working with, you think might be a danger to themselves because they're forgetting to turn the stove off or put their cigarette out at night. They may be a danger to themselves, or you may be concerned that they are, but their right to self-determination takes precedence over that. If they want to live at home and stay at home, then it's your job to work with them to do so in as safe a manner as possible. If you think, well, I'll leave it at that for now. Fourth, a person's right to well-being may override laws, policies, and arrangements of organizations. I think this is a really interesting one. A person's right to well-being, to safety, and to their life may override laws, policies, and arrangements of organizations. Super obvious example is segregation, right? Racial segregation. That was the law of the land in the 1950s. And many places chose not to enforce that law because it impacts the right to well-being of people of color. Nowadays, I think I might have given this example in class about I was working in an organization, again, that served transgender young people, and the organization had a police officer stationed in the front for security, and the police officers required every young person to sign in with their government ID and use their government name, even if they had transitioned to female and had now a female name that differed from the male name on their government-issued identification. This is a very humiliating experience for transgender young people and very invalidating in their very core sense of who they are. So I had to work with my organization to say this policy of having them have to show their ID, even though it's for safety reasons, theoretically, is overriding their right, our own clients' right to well-being. And ultimately, we were able to change that policy in our organization. We talked about confidentiality. That's the other kind of core ethical principle that comes up the most. Generally, the exceptions to confidentiality with clients are that you will be discussing their case to get supervision and consultation when needed, that you will break confidentiality if you think they are a danger to themselves, to others, or if you suspect child abuse or else. Reminders that minors in Minnesota require parental consent for health or mental health if they're under 18, except if the treatment is for pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, alcohol, drug abuse, hepatitis B, and often LGBTQ youth can be seen under this exception. Remember, the age of consent for sexual activity in Minnesota is 16 years. And regarding regarding abortion, minors seeking an abortion in Minnesota must legally notify both parents of the intended abortion and then wait 48 hours before having the procedure. The exception is that they can get judicial approval instead of parent notification if they are able to go before a judge and say that they are mature enough to make this decision on their own, and or that it might jeopardize their well-being to tell their parents. In other words, they may be threatened by their parents with being kicked out or physical or emotional abuse. Okay, so this is the last slide. These are the steps for making difficult ethical decisions. And I'm going to be giving you an assignment with some scenarios where you're going to have to apply these steps into making ethical decisions, your best guess ethical decisions without the help of supervisors, unless you were able to call someone. So step one is to review the code of ethics and principles set down by the NASW when you're reviewing a situation. Review any laws or regulations about that situation. Consult with colleagues, supervisors, or legal experts. Then really think about all the possible courses of action you could take in a situation and imagine the consequences of each action. Finally, decide which action best aligns to the ethical decision-making. So when you have a situation that arises, let's say a client wants to Facebook friend you, these are the steps you would take to resolve whether you should do that or not. Okay, so look forward to seeing you all in class and seeing your responses to the ethical dilemmas I'll post. Take care, everybody. Besides laws that we have here on the left, on the right we have our ethical obligations. And that's not necessarily required by law, but things like boundaries, providing informed consent to clients is actually more of a legal obligation these days. But the discussion about whether or not to accept gifts from clients or Facebook friend them, those are questions about ethics, not so much about laws. And then in the middle, when you were lucky, the law and ethics line up. So the example they give here on the slide is that a law is driving while under the influence. That's clearly against the law. An ethical obligation is to explore dual relationships with clients. In other words, if you and the client go to the same church and have joined the same Bible study group, are you now ethically obligated to disclose that to your supervisor to figure out how to manage those boundaries? That's a bit of an ethical dilemma. And then where there's overlap between the law and ethical obligations, the example they give is sexual involvement with a client. It is both against the law and unethical to be sexually involved with a client. So that's a little bit about the difference between law and ethics, and we're kind of talking about both of those things here.